They thought the cameras had cut, the lights dimmed, the debate was over. But somewhere between the smug smile and the backstage whispers, Lauren Boebert said something she never meant for America to hear. One line, sharp, dismissive, caught by a mic that refused to go silent. And just like that, the game changed. AOC didn't storm out. She didn't tweet. She didn't clap back. She simply waited, watched, and when the moment came, she moved. No insults, no volume. Just one action so poised, so precise, it didn't just silence a critic, it awakened a country. This story is a dramatization, rooted in fictional events but inspired by real tensions, real stakes, and the very real power of grace under fire. Because while the dialogue may be imagined, the emotion is not. And in a world full of noise, sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. The air backstage always feels heavier than the set itself. Maybe it's the combination of studio lights bleeding in from the curtain gaps, or the muffled chatter of producers counting seconds like heartbeats. Maybe it's the knowledge that when the red light turns on, you're not just performing for voters, but for history. Lauren Boebert was already mic'd, lips touched up in matte defiance, pacing in clipped, impatient steps. Her boots thudded against the hollow floor like she wanted the sound to carry. She wasn't nervous. She was rehearsing a takedown. Not policy, not substance. A soundbite. Leaning in toward one of her aides, young, anxious, holding an iPad like it might bite, she smirked. "We're not just going to debate tonight. We're going to remind America who that girl really is. AOC, the bartender with a spotlight. Let's see how she handles a flashlight." The aide half laughed, half swallowed hard. He didn't say it out loud, but he wasn't sure the country needed reminding. Meanwhile, just 20 feet away, separated by a hallway lined with light boxes and discarded cue cards, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat still. Not stiff, not frozen. Still, like someone conserving energy before a sprint. Her posture was open, but her eyes scanned her folder with surgeon-level focus. It wasn't debate prep anymore. It was pattern recognition. She wasn't looking for zingers. She was mapping pressure points. A vote Boebert skipped on emergency food funding, a PAC donation she denied ever receiving, until the FEC report said otherwise. The eviction rates spiking in Boebert's district while she campaigned about personal responsibility. Her pen didn't move. Her lips barely parted. But her mind was building a quiet architecture, fact by fact, statistic by name, headline by hypocrisy. Someone offered her a final touch of powder. She waved it off with a soft smile. "Let them see the pores. We're not here to play smooth." The studio stage manager counted down in the distance. 10 minutes. Let's go dark for audio checks." Somewhere, a lav mic hissed to life. Back in Boebert's corner, the vibe had shifted from bravado to calculation. "Make her play defense," Boebert told her team. "Force her off script. If she starts quoting numbers, say, 'You sound like ChatGPT.' If she brings up her childhood, say you didn't come here for a TED Talk." It wasn't a debate strategy. It was heckling in heels. But here's the thing about AOC. She doesn't just memorize facts. She remembers feelings. She remembers what it was like when people used that same tone to question why she spoke so proper for someone from the Bronx. She remembers being asked who helped her write her sentences. And she remembers the silence after she didn't flinch. As the audience filed in, hundreds of bodies shifting into cushioned seats under the low hum of anticipation, a subtle tension hung in the dressing corridor. A staffer accidentally bumped into Boebert's team, muttering a rushed apology. Boebert barely acknowledged it. AOC, meanwhile, stood, straightened the cuff of her blazer, and softly thanked the janitor sweeping the corner with a slow broom. The camera wouldn't catch that. But truth has a funny way of leaking past the edits. The moderator's voice came through the headset. "Welcome to tonight's debate. Representative Lauren Boebert and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez join us live." The music swelled. The crowd applauded. Boebert squared her shoulders like she was entering a ring. AOC stepped forward, not with swagger, but steadiness, as if she already knew the loudest moment of the night might be the one no one planned. The lights were warm, almost too warm, casting a soft blur over polished podiums and perfectly timed applause. From the outside, it looked like every other televised debate. Two microphones, two names, one moderator doing their best to herd two storms into a single frame. But from the first exchange, it became clear. This wasn't going to be a policy discussion. This was going to be a pressure test. Lauren Boebert launched early, barely waiting for the moderator's opening question on federal budget allocation. With a laugh that felt rehearsed and razor-thin, she called the latest housing proposal a socialist wish list written in crayon. Then came the first real jab, wrapped in charm, dipped in condescension. I'm just saying, some of us didn't grow up behind a bar counting tips and calling that economics. There was a pause, not long enough for outrage, but just long enough for the audience to register the cut. Boebert smiled wider, as if she expected Alexandria to snap back, to let her Bronx roots flare, to take the bait and give her the viral clip she'd been rehearsing for backstage. But AOC didn't flinch. She tilted her head slightly, almost like she was studying Boebert rather than responding to her. And then, with a voice that didn't rise in pitch or power, but settled in firmness, she said, "We're talking about public dollars, not personal digs." Then she pivoted, smoothly, sharply, to the numbers. The latest federal budget had reduced funding to veteran housing vouchers by 12%, she noted, while allocating increases to private military contractors with known ethics violations. She quoted not a policy brief, but a veteran named Marquez from Arizona, Boebert's home turf, who had been sleeping in his truck while waiting for housing approval. It wasn't a rebuttal, it was a redirection. Boebert blinked briefly, then tried again, this time mocking Alexandria's phrasing. "Oh, here we go again with the poetic metaphors and community theater energy. Did you bring the applause signs too?" Another smattering of laughter from one side of the audience. But AOC kept her hands folded, her posture unshaken. "No applause signs," she replied calmly. "Just data and decades of underfunded neighborhoods asking why Congress always finds the money for war, but not for roofs." The room shifted, not dramatically but perceptibly. You could feel it in the way even the moderator adjusted her cards, as though suddenly remembering this wasn't just theater, this was testimony. And Boebert, for all her volume and venom, began to look slightly reactive, like someone driving a race she thought she was leading, only to realize the track had already shifted beneath her. Then came the question about PAC money. Boebert boasted about standing up to coastal elites in their dark money. But AOC responded by calmly citing Boebert's campaign filings, pointing out a $40,000 donation from a PAC linked to a real estate conglomerate currently under investigation for housing discrimination. Still no raised voice, no sarcasm, just precise facts, delivered in the tone of someone who'd learned long ago that being underestimated is exhausting, but also useful. Then AOC did something that wasn't in the notes. She looked straight into the camera. Not for long. Just long enough for viewers to feel like she wasn't talking to Boebert anymore, or the moderator, or the pundits waiting backstage. She was talking to someone watching from a break room in Toledo, or a nursing shift in El Paso, or a subway ride in the Bronx. I know what it's like to stretch one paycheck across 3 responsibilities. I know what it's like to be told you're too loud, too brown, too young, too emotional to be taken seriously. So if you're watching this and you've ever been made to feel small because of where you started, let me say this clearly. This seat doesn't belong to pedigree. It belongs to perseverance. That wasn't a political point. It was a reminder. And in that moment, Boebert's smirk faded. Not all the way, but enough. Enough that the camera caught it. The segment ended with the moderator thanking both guests for their spirited exchange. But the air between them held no spirit. One side buzzed with unspent static. The other, quiet, measured, was already walking off stage with a folder tucked beneath her arm and something unshaken in her spine. And somewhere, though no one noticed yet, a small red light on a boom mic kept blinking. Still on, still listening. The final bell of a debate doesn't ring, it exhales. Lights dim just slightly, the moderator's script winds down, and the audience, unsure whether to clap or sigh, often does a little of both. The words are still echoing, but the performance is technically over. Lauren Boebert adjusted her mic with a theatrical flick of her wrist, flashing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She leaned into the final question, not to answer it, but to claim it. I'm proud to represent real Americans, the kind who don't need lectures, they need leadership, and they know a rehearsed monologue when they hear one. The dig was barely disguised, but she didn't wait for a response. With her exit already choreographed in her mind, she stepped back from the podium, gave the audience a half salute, and strode off stage, heels striking the wood like punctuation marks. It was a practiced performance of defiance. Part warrior, part escape artist. AOC didn't follow. She stood still, allowing the moment to breathe. Then, with the calm of someone who knew the real work had been done long before the cameras rolled, she turned to the moderator. Thank you for the questions, and for the space to answer them fully. There was something disarming in how genuine that line sounded. Not rehearsed, not weaponized, just present. Then she looked back out toward the audience, not to charm, not to campaign, but to land softly where truth often lives. Noise fades, records stay, and the truth, it tends to age better than bravado. A few heads nodded, a few pens scribbled. The audience clapped again, not wildly, but differently this time, like they were clapping for something they didn't expect to feel. The cameras stopped rolling. Stage hands moved quickly. The illusion of television dissolved into wires and makeup towels and half-finished bottles of water. But a mic, one of many, was still live, still humming, still listening. Backstage, Boebert was already unzipping her jacket, tossing her debate notes into the hands of an aide without looking. Her tone shifted, not the public pitch of performance, but the sharper, unfiltered cadence of someone who had held her tongue just long enough. Well, she did it again. She plays Congress like she plays poor people, just good enough to keep the tips coming. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It was said with the kind of confidence reserved for closed rooms, where the audience is handpicked and the consequences feel comfortably out of reach. A nearby production assistant, not more than 23, froze in place. She wasn't a staffer, not part of the press pool, just part of the quiet scaffolding that holds up shows like this. She glanced toward the boom operator, who was still packing equipment. Their eyes met, and neither spoke. Somewhere in the control room, audio was still rolling, not because someone planned it, but because sometimes the truth refuses to clock out. And just like that, a single sentence, clipped, careless, and meant for no one, began its slow orbit outward. It hadn't gone viral yet. It hadn't even left the room. But it had been said, and someone had heard it. Back on stage, AOC was already gathering her notes, moving with the quiet discipline of someone who had stopped expecting applause and started listening for impact. She didn't know what had been said, not yet, but later, when asked why she didn't rush to respond, she would smile gently and say, "Because not every fire deserves oxygen, and not every truth needs me to speak it." The editing bay smelled faintly of burnt coffee and static. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, indifferent to the weight of what was about to happen beneath them. Theo, a junior sound technician, barely a year out of trade school, had been assigned the midnight shift, cleaning up audio from the evening's live political broadcast. It was routine work, the kind no one notices unless something goes wrong. He adjusted his headphones, scrolling through waveform timelines, looking for clipping, smoothing transitions between segments. The debate itself was already being dissected online, who interrupted whom, which poll numbers would shift. But Theo wasn't focused on any of that. His job wasn't commentary, it was clarity. Then he heard it, a clipped post-show sliver of audio, tucked behind the final applause and under the bed of shuffling footsteps. Most editors would have trimmed the tail and moved on, but Theo, out of habit or curiosity, tapped the volume up instead. Boebert's voice came through, clean, sharp, laced with something colder than her on-camera smirk. She plays Congress like she plays poor people, just good enough to keep the tips coming. Theo froze. He replayed it, once, twice. There was no mistaking it. No background chatter, no ambiguity. It wasn't satire. It wasn't a joke. It was contempt. His first instinct was procedural. Flag the clip, report it to the senior editor, log the timestamp. But something made him pause. Maybe it was the fact that he'd grown up watching his mom come home from double shifts at a diner. Sleeves rolled past the elbow, cash tips crumpled in a side pouch like tokens of invisible labor. Maybe it was the way Boebert had said it, like she'd said it before, like it wasn't a slip, it was a worldview. Theo minimized the editing window. He stared at the blinking cursor in a blank email. He didn't have connections, just a Twitter burner account and the name of a journalist he trusted. Someone who had once written about food insecurity in Appalachia, not because it was trending, but because it mattered. He attached the audio clip. No name, no signature, just a subject line. Mike was still on. People should hear this. He clicked to send. Then he unplugged his headphones and sat in silence for a long time. The post hit the internet at 12:07 a.m. Eastern. The audio was short, under 15 seconds, but it didn't need length. It needed impact, and it had it. By 1:45 a.m., it had been reposted by a well-known policy analyst with the caption, "This isn't just a hot mic, it's a cold heart." By 3 a.m., screenshots had made their way onto TikTok, layered over footage of waitresses, single moms, teachers pushing carts through underfunded classrooms. The clip wasn't just being heard, it was being felt. By 6:20 a.m., it was in rotation on cable news tickers. CNN ran the Chiron. Representative Boebert caught on hot mic. Comment sparks outrage. MSNBC called it class warfare unmasked. Even Fox, in its own carefully hedged language, admitted the comment was raising eyebrows across both parties. And by 8 a.m., 3 hashtags were trending across every major platform. Hashtag Mick was still on. Hashtag say it again. Lauren. Hashtag we. Heard you for some, it was just another political firestorm, one more headline in a sea of outrage. But for others, especially those who had spent their lives being dismissed by that same tone, it landed differently. It wasn't just about AOC. It was about everyone who'd ever been called just a waitress, just a janitor, just a name on a payroll. And while Boebert's team was scrambling to prepare a statement and AOC's team remained notably silent, the public had already begun writing its own story. A story about how, sometimes, the truth doesn't need a stage. It just needs someone to forget the mic was still on. By mid-morning, the clip was no longer just a clip. It had become a mirror, one that forced a nation to look at the gap between representation and reality, between how some speak behind cameras and how others live beyond them. People weren't merely reacting to the words Boebert said, they were reacting to the way she said them, the ease in her tone, the absence of pause, the casualness of the cruelty. Veterans began posting videos from their cars, still in uniform, voice trembling, not with rage but with quiet betrayal. "I don't agree with AOC on everything," one Marine-turned-school counselor said, "but don't you dare talk about people like my mom, like we're props on your debate stage." His clip was shared over 100,000 times in a single afternoon. Public school teachers joined the chorus. Some recorded short clips in empty classrooms during lunch break, standing in front of outdated whiteboards and frayed library posters. "We've been told for years that we're part of the problem," one woman in Indiana said. But hearing it said that openly, that coldly, that wasn't a hot mic, that was her heart. On factory floors and parking lots, in kitchen nooks beside chipped counters and coffee mugs from night shifts past, working-class Americans weren't just scrolling, they were seething. The clip hadn't gone viral because it was scandalous. It went viral because it was familiar. Too familiar. Boebert's team responded, eventually. The statement landed just before noon, typed in clean lines on a white background, devoid of apology, full of deflection. The Congresswoman's comments are being taken out of context and do not reflect her deep respect for working Americans and her tireless efforts to serve them. But there was no explanation of what the context was. No elaboration, no contrition, just enough words to check the box and maybe, just maybe, make it through the news cycle. But this story wasn't moving on. Not yet. Pundits began circling the absence of response from one person in particular. AOC hadn't said a word, no press release, no social post, not even a retweet. And that silence began to take on its own meaning. Not avoidance, but choice. Morning show anchors leaned in as they asked the same question across networks. Where is her response? Some speculated she was preparing a legal challenge. Others thought she might appear on a primetime interview. But those who had followed her longer, the teachers, the servers, the nurses who remembered her first campaign video, sensed something different. She wasn't rushing, because she didn't need to. One commentator on a late-night political wrap-up show said it plainly. This is a test, not for AOC, for us. She's watching how we handle this, how we carry it, and she's deciding whether we're ready to listen without her raising her voice. In a quiet corner of Capitol Hill, someone asked her staff if she would issue a statement by evening. Her aide simply smiled, closed his notebook, and replied, "If you listen carefully, you'll notice. Some of the strongest answers don't arrive right away. They arrive when the noise has no one left to echo it." Meanwhile, online, the momentum didn't slow. Artists turned Boebert's words into protest posters. Someone printed the quote across the bottom of a receipt from a Bronx diner and posted a picture of it online. Underneath it, handwritten in pen, were the words, "We don't forget what you say when you think we're not listening." Outside the narrative machine of newsrooms and political strategists, something real was stirring, not orchestrated, not slick. Just millions of small personal reckonings waking up at once. And at the center of it, a woman said nothing, because the moment was already speaking. The storm swirled outside her office window, digital, political, cultural. But inside, the pace was different. No slammed doors, no frantic typing, just the gentle rhythm of pages turning and a pencil tapping once, then again, in thought. Advisors came in waves, some with polling data, others with drafted statements. They brought suggestions, urgency, and headlines freshly printed with phrases like, "AOC's silence leaves vacuum," and "Boebert under fire, but Ocasio-Cortez stays mum." She listened to them all, grateful, but not hurried. One longtime friend leaned in with the kind of worried intimacy only true confidants carry. "You know you could end her with a single clip. Just one tweet. They're begging for it." AOC looked up, not with disagreement, but with that quiet pause she always carried right before speaking, like she was weighing the moral weight of a syllable. "If a house is collapsing on its own," she said softly, "why rush in to kick it?" It wasn't passivity, it was patience, and maybe a little strategy. The truth was, she wasn't ignoring what happened. She was studying it, not the noise, but the pattern beneath it. The same tone Boebert had used backstage was one she'd heard before, in classrooms, in boardrooms, in green rooms, behind glossy talk shows. Dismissive, casual, performed for someone who wasn't in the room. So she took notes, but not on how to clap back, on how to clarify. She pulled up Boebert's voting history, especially the bills that dealt with housing subsidies, minimum wage blocks, and small business loan rejections. She highlighted quotes Boebert had given to fringe radio stations about poverty being a choice of mindset. She watched the town hall footage where Boebert had joked that nobody needs a handout, just a pair of boots. AOC didn't write a rebuttal. She started outlining a story, because that's how she fought, not with daggers, but with threads. She didn't aim to wound, she aimed to reveal. At lunch, one of her younger staffers slid into her office and asked hesitantly, "Do you want to record a short reaction? Even a reel? We could go live in 15 minutes. She smiled, kind but firm. "If I speak now, I join the spiral. But if I wait, I might help reshape it." And so she waited. She watered the plants on her windowsill. She returned calls from local organizers in Queens who didn't mention the clip at all. Instead, they talked about transit issues, teacher shortages, and the lack of shade in summer schoolyards. She listened to them as if the world hadn't just thrown her into its spotlight again. But at night, when the office was quiet and only a sliver of hallway light leaked beneath her door, she did her own kind of prep. Not for revenge, for resonance. She scrolled through comments not from influencers, but from lunch workers, veterans, janitors. She read long threads written by single moms and grocery clerks and night nurses who weren't demanding outrage, but recognition. What they wanted wasn't spectacle. It was someone who understood that dignity isn't something you fight over. It's something you protect when others try to strip it away. She scribbled something in her notebook, circled it twice. It wasn't a quote, it was a reminder. Don't perform, reflect, don't escalate, illuminate. The headlines continued screaming. Panels continued speculating. Boebert's team hinted she was the victim of a smear campaign. But none of that rattled her. Because AOC had never won her battles by being louder. She won them by being clearer. And clarity takes time. So while the country braced for her to speak, she did what few in politics are brave enough to do. She thought. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. Movements don't begin with fireworks. They begin with friction. One moment quietly rubs against another until something catches. By the second evening, Boebert's words weren't just headlines. They had become cultural shorthand. Not because they were shocking in isolation, but because they echoed something people had long suspected but rarely heard so plainly. A kind of disdain that had always lingered in policy decisions, but now had a voice, a tone, a timestamp. Late-night hosts opened their monologues with clips from the debate, each one slicing the moment in their own comedic dialect. One played the clip, then simply stared into the camera, eyebrows raised, letting the silence do the work. The audience laughed, but not comfortably. It was the laughter that comes when the truth feels too familiar. But it wasn't the jokes that stuck. It was what came after. A veteran from Georgia, gray-bearded, weathered, seated in his truck with a flag folded in the passenger seat, recorded a video at dusk. No production, just gravel in his voice and the weight of memory in his eyes. He didn't yell, he didn't plead, he just said, "I served with guys who waited tables when they weren't in uniform. I buried a friend who left behind 2 kids and a wife still working double shifts. Don't you dare tell me those folks are props." The clip spread fast, reaching over 2 million views by morning. Then came the pastor. He stood in front of a small wooden pulpit in Flint, Michigan. No lights, no hashtags, just an iPhone on a shaky tripod. He told his congregation about his daughter, how she worked nights at a diner while studying to be a nurse, how she paid for her textbooks 1 tip jar at a time, how she never asked for pity, only respect. Then he said plainly, "My daughter works tips, but she works truth." The room erupted in quiet affirmation. And that one sentence, sincere, spare, unforgettable, became the line that ricocheted through every social feed. TikTok duets bloomed overnight. People added their own faces, their own stories. Line cooks, delivery drivers, retired librarians, hospice aides. One video paired Boebert's voice with a slow montage of worn hands, name tags and shift change schedules, captioned with, "This is what contempt sounds like." It was no longer about one woman's slip of the tongue. It was about a culture that had grown comfortable turning labor into punchlines. High school teachers began playing the clip in civics classes, not to stir outrage, but to spark conversation. One student asked, "Is this who Congress thinks we are?" Another said, "I always thought they said that stuff behind closed doors, but now it's like they don't even care if we hear it." The teacher wrote those words on the board. "They don't even care if we hear it." The room fell quiet. In cities and towns across the country, murals started appearing. Not elaborate, but sharp. A waitress drawn in profile with her hand raised like a mic. A phrase painted beneath, "We're done serving silence." Meanwhile, AOC still hadn't spoken. And somehow that made everything louder. Reporters who had once dismissed her as theatrical were now beginning to rethink. Editorials asked whether her restraint had reframed the entire narrative. "Perhaps," one columnist wrote, "the silence we thought was inaction was actually instruction. She showed us who the story was really about, and it wasn't her." And in that pause, long enough for voices to rise but not collapse under the weight of fury, a country began to reckon not just with one sentence, but with all the sentences it had ignored for far too long. By day 3, the clip had outgrown the cycle. It wasn't a trending topic anymore. It had become a case study. Colleges were discussing it in communication ethics classes. Churches brought it up in sermons. Union halls had it playing on loop before meetings. You could feel the shift, not just in public sentiment, but in something deeper, something that didn't shout, something that simply turned away. And still, AOC said nothing. No interviews, no snarky tweets, no shadowboxing on social media. The silence wasn't empty, it was deliberate, a slow, steady refusal to join the chaos. It gave her critics nothing to fight. It gave her supporters something rare in politics, room to feel. But silence, as always, made others louder. Lauren Boebert appeared on a conservative talk radio show that Thursday morning, one of those programs where the host preaches grievance like gospel, and every call-in is a choir of resentment. She wasn't introduced as a representative. She was introduced as a fighter under siege, and she leaned into it. She dismissed the backlash as selective outrage, orchestrated by keyboard activists and what she called the usual woke mob with nothing better to do. She didn't deny the quote. She didn't clarify it. She defied it. I'm not apologizing to people who've never waited tables and want to tell me how real life works. It was meant to sound tough. It came off tired. And for the first time, even some of her usual allies flinched. Because the people she was targeting, they had waited tables. They were real life. The radio host chuckled, tried to move her to safer ground, but the line had landed, and not in the way she intended. It didn't provoke strength. It exposed distance. Boebert wasn't pushing back against criticism. She was widening the chasm. Within hours, campaign donors began quietly reaching out to her finance team. Not pulling funding, yet, but asking questions they hadn't asked before. One longtime supporter in Colorado Springs canceled an upcoming fundraiser, citing a need to reevaluate the campaign's tone. Another PAC removed her from a featured speaking slot, noting a desire to avoid distraction. The numbers began to shift, not dramatically, but noticeably. Polling in her district showed a 5-point dip in favorability among independent voters and a surprising 3-point drop among working-class Republicans, a group that had once been her base. Still, Boebert remained on the offensive. She posted a photo on Instagram later that day with a caption about standing firm and not backing down. But the comments weren't what they used to be. They weren't filled with fire emojis and flag-waving cheers. They were quieter, shorter. Some just said, disappointed. One read, I voted for you because you said you understood people like me. You just showed us you don't. Meanwhile, AOC was in a community center in the Bronx, helping organize a resource fair for tenants facing eviction. No cameras, no speech, just presence. One organizer posted a photo of her folding chairs, sleeves rolled, expression relaxed. The caption read, when you don't chase attention, it follows differently. Back in Washington, reporters kept pressing. Would she respond to Boebert's latest comment? Would she strike back now? Her team issued nothing. And the silence, rather than weakening her, seemed to add gravity to everything that had already been said, just not by her. One cable anchor put it this way, Boebert is shouting into a void, and the void is starting to sound like her own echo. And perhaps that was the deepest irony of it all. The more Boebert spoke, the more AOC's silence sharpened. It was like watching someone argue in an empty room, only to realize the room wasn't empty at all. It was just listening more carefully than she expected. The sun had dipped low over D.C., casting long amber shadows through AOC's office windows. Most of her team had already left for the evening. The hall's quiet except for the occasional echo of heels from a distant corridor. Her laptop was closed, unread emails stacked like unopened letters at the corner of her desk. She wasn't ignoring the moment, just allowing it to land on its own terms. Her phone buzzed once, then again. The name that lit up made her smile. Jasmine Crockett. She picked up without hesitation. There was no small talk, just a long breath on the other end, the kind only someone familiar with the weight of public scrutiny would understand. And then Jasmine's voice, low, firm, and laced with something tender beneath the steel. I've had moments like that too. A pause, just enough space for recognition to pass silently between them. But you're holding still, Jasmine added, and letting the world tilt toward you. It wasn't a compliment, it was a knowing, a kind of solidarity that didn't need explanation, only witness. They both understood what it meant to be dissected publicly, not just for what you said, but for how you looked while saying it, what you wore, how your eyebrows moved, whether your voice carried anger or dignity, or too much of either. AOC leaned back in her chair, a quiet laugh slipping through her exhaustion. You remember that panel from last year? The one where they edited my sentence mid-thought and then played it as a soundbite for 2 weeks? Jasmine groaned through a smile. Girl, I still have that clipped into a group chat called We Tried to Warn Y'all. They laughed, not the carefree kind, but the kind shared by people who've made it through storms wearing heels and armor sewn from restraint. There was comfort in the humor, but also a map, a trail of memory tracing every moment they'd been told they were too loud, too poised, too sharp, too unapologetic. Their conversation drifted, as it often did, into that quiet space where strategy and survival meet. They didn't discuss vengeance. They didn't need to. This wasn't about landing punches. It was about choosing the right time to hold the mirror. Jasmine lowered her voice, not out of secrecy, but reverence. You could have scorched her. You still can. But somehow, this is more. AOC's fingers tapped her desk lightly, not anxious, just focused. She had been thinking about that same idea all week, that maybe power wasn't always about who speaks louder, but who can sit still long enough for the noise to reveal itself. Let's make the silence speak, she said, not as a declaration, but as an invitation. And Jasmine understood. Because sometimes what moves people isn't the mic drop. It's the pause that follows, the stillness that leaves room for reflection, not just reaction. They didn't talk much longer. Just enough to remember they weren't alone in this. As they hung up, AOC sat for a while in that rare kind of quiet, the kind that doesn't come from turning down the volume, but from realizing you no longer need to raise your own. Outside, DC traffic carried on. Inside, she reopened her notebook, not to script a response, but to start something else, something slower, deeper. The story wasn't done, but it had shifted, and so had the center of gravity. It was a Friday evening, quiet in Washington, loud everywhere else. The story hadn't faded. It had only grown roots. Editorials still circled. Panelists still spun it from every angle. But somewhere, a subtle fatigue had begun to set in. People were tired of outrage without purpose. They were waiting, not for drama, but for direction. At exactly 7:02 p.m. Eastern, a notification pinged on millions of screens. At AOC is going live. No teaser. No announcement tour. Just a simple caption above the stream window. Since the mic was on, let's talk. No capital letters. No dramatic font. Just clarity. And yet within 15 minutes, the viewer count passed 1 million. The setting wasn't glamorous. AOC sat at a plain wooden desk, her hair loosely pulled back, a soft glow from a single lamp behind her. No flags, no digital banners. Just her, a worn legal pad to the side, and the kind of direct eye contact that makes you forget there's a screen in between. She didn't start with fire. She started with breath. Hi. One word offered not like a greeting, but a grounding. She paused, letting the moment settle. Then she looked into the lens, not to perform, but to connect. I've been quiet, not because I didn't hear what was said, but because I wanted to listen longer than I usually get to. No script, no teleprompter, just sentences shaped by lived memory. She didn't mention Boebert by name. She didn't replay the clip. She didn't need to. The country had already done that on its own. She wasn't there to recycle scandal. She was there to offer context no trending clip could hold. She spoke of the dignity of work, real work, the kind where you're on your feet for 8 hours, where your name tag fades faster than your paycheck clears. She told a story about her aunt in Puerto Rico, who once kept receipts in her apron pocket not to track tips, but to remind herself she hadn't disappeared. She spoke softly, not solemnly, and somehow that softness carried farther than shouting ever could. For some people, she said, waiting tables is something they survived on their way to something else. For others, it's what fed their kids, built their lives, kept their dignity intact in a world that pretends not to see them. But I see them, because I was them. The comments section lit up. Lines of hearts, crying face emojis, one-word affirmations like, yes. But AOC didn't look down to read. She kept her gaze forward, steady, intentional, like she was speaking to someone just across the table. She didn't argue. She reflected. And that distinction, subtle as it was, turned the live stream from a response into a reckoning. She paused briefly, glanced at her legal pad, then set it aside. I didn't come here to fight. I came here to name what too many people hear in silence. That sneer, that shrug, that sideways comment made behind closed doors that tells you exactly how some people really see you. Another pause, then. But here's what I know. The mic wasn't just on for her. It's on for all of us now. And what we say next, that's what matters. No anger, no performative sadness, just conviction tempered by time. As she reached the end, she offered no grand solution, no promise to fix it all by next vote. Just a quiet call. Keep talking. Not just online, but at the dinner table, in the break room, in the classroom, wherever you are. Talk about what respect sounds like. Then, almost as an afterthought, she smiled gently and added, and maybe what it doesn't. The live stream ended without outro music, no campaign plug, just a screen that faded slowly to black. And still, long after it ended, the country kept watching. Not because they were waiting for something more, but because they finally felt like something had been said. The live stream didn't feel like a political address. It felt like an open letter, one written in breath, in pause, in the soft edges of memory rather than the sharp corners of sound bites. And as AOC continued, she didn't lift her voice. She deepened it, not in volume, but in meaning. She didn't go after Boebert. There was no point. The moment had never been about one woman's words. It was about the world they revealed. So instead, AOC turned the lens toward the ones whose names wouldn't make headlines, but whose lives had always filled the margins. She talked about the women who serve coffee and carry burdens, the ones whose shoes squeak through hospital corridors, whose backs bend behind counters, whose hands are raw from sanitizer and grocery bags, and holding too much together with too little help. She spoke not as their defender, but as their reflection. I think about my mother, she said, gaze steady. Her hands were so calloused by the time I was 12, I thought that's how adult hands were supposed to feel. She didn't frame it as a tragedy, just a truth, one carried by millions. She told how her mother cleaned homes in Queens, always saving the best tips to replace school shoes, always whispering Spanish beneath her breath when bills didn't stretch far enough. Then she shifted, almost imperceptibly, to a story about a teacher. 7th grade, Ms. Lemansky, the kind of teacher who always had a drawer of extra pencils, not because the school provided them, but because she knew her students didn't always have the luxury of being prepared. AOC smiled when she mentioned her, like the memory still lived in a corner of her chest that hadn't hardened. She never said, "You should have brought your own." She just handed over what we needed and kept going. That's what real public service looks like. Quiet generosity, no cameras, no quotes for the press. She paused there, not for drama, but for air. And it was in that pause that the speech shifted. It wasn't about biography anymore. It was about invitation. You know, she continued, her voice softer now, almost conspiratorial. People keep asking if I feel betrayed by what was said. She looked down briefly, then back up. But it wasn't the mic that betrayed her. It was the truth trying to crawl out. The words didn't land with applause. They landed with stillness, the kind that makes people stop scrolling, stop multitasking, stop waiting for the next moment, because they realize this is the moment. She didn't name Boebert. She didn't need to. The power of the speech was in its refusal to perform the expected. There was no vengeance in her voice, only precision. We've heard this kind of thing for years, maybe not always on tape, but in the way people look past us, in the way they explain poverty as a lack of effort, not a lack of equity, in the way they talk about real Americans and never mean anyone who cleans bathrooms for a living. The live stream chat filled again, but this time fewer hearts, more full sentences. That was my mom. She just described my whole upbringing. I didn't know politicians could talk like this. AOC closed her notes, though it was clear she hadn't used them much, and leaned forward, as if making room for those watching on tiny cracked screens late at night, between shifts or during dishes. What happens next doesn't depend on a mic. It depends on whether we decide that dignity shouldn't be something you have to prove to deserve. Then, almost as a whisper, some people build their power by talking down. We build ours by lifting up. And with that, she closed the live stream. No dramatic sign-off, just a quiet nod, the kind you give someone when words aren't enough and presence has to do the rest. The end came not with a crescendo, but with a sentence so soft it landed like truth, whispered between generations. They said I should be insulted. I'm not, because every time they tell us we don't belong, we show them we do. And then, just like that, the screen faded to black. No signature wave, no campaign message, no catchy music to escort viewers out. Just a sudden quiet. And in that quiet, the world shifted, not because something exploded, but because something finally landed. For a few seconds, viewers sat frozen, millions of them, not tapping the screen, not hitting replay, just absorbing. Because the moment hadn't asked them to react, it had asked them to remember. The first clip went live less than 2 minutes after the stream ended. Someone had recorded the closing line and paired it with archival footage. AOC walking into Congress for the first time, her red lipstick bright against the Capitol's stone walls. Her posture still uncertain, but already unshakable. No voiceover, just her words, her voice, a microphone, and then silence. By morning, the clip had been reshared by presidents. One former president called it the most graceful rebuttal I've ever seen. An artist from Detroit painted the quote on the side of a food bank truck. A conservative talk show host, known for rarely giving her credit, tweeted simply, "That was grace." Grace, a word not often used in political commentary, but that's what it was. Not a counterattack, not a point scored, something quieter, braver, harder to dismiss. Even some of Boebert's own supporters began to speak out. A small-town mayor in Colorado posted, "I don't agree with her policies, but I watched that live stream with my wife. We both sat in silence afterward. I think I needed that." For once, the internet didn't descend into chaos. It paused. It let the stillness hold. And in that stillness, people found themselves reflecting, not just on what had been said, but on what had been revealed. The line about belonging hit a chord, not just with women, or service workers, or first-generation college grads, but with anyone who'd ever been told they were too much, too little, too loud, too brown, too soft-spoken, too working class, too other. A teacher in Nevada rewrote her Monday lesson plan to include the live stream. She asked her students, "Have you ever felt like you had to prove you belong somewhere?" Every hand in the room went up. A college student in North Carolina printed the quote and taped it to her dorm door. A teenage boy in Chicago added it to his phone lock screen. The storm that had begun with a careless whisper off camera now ended with millions listening more carefully than ever before. And at the center of it, a woman who had chosen not to fight noise with noise, but to let the silence carry weight. AOC didn't tweet the clip. She didn't retweet the praise. She didn't appear on the talk show circuit the next morning, despite a full inbox of offers. She went back to work, quietly, intentionally, showing up to a meeting on housing infrastructure with handwritten notes and a thermos of coffee. Because that was the point all along. They said she should be insulted, that she should erupt, defend herself, reclaim her worth with volume. But instead, she stayed still. And the world noticed the difference between ego and example. The mic had never really turned off. It had only changed hands. And now it was in the living rooms and classrooms and break rooms of people who realized that belonging was never something to be granted by power. It was something claimed in grace, carried in stories, and sealed by the courage not to answer hate with heat, but with light. It didn't unravel all at once. Not with a headline or a scandal or a smoking gun. No, what happened to Boebert came apart the way credibility often does. Quietly, piece by piece, while the person holding the thread pretends it's still whole. By Monday morning, the silence surrounding AOC's live stream had become deafening. It echoed in places Boebert never expected it to reach. Boardrooms, pulpits, veterans' halls, and maybe most uncomfortably, the inboxes of her own donors. At first it was subtle, a canceled dinner fundraiser in Fort Collins, no explanation offered. Then came the withdrawn RSVP from a high-profile real estate PAC in Denver. One by one, checks stopped arriving. Then came the messages. Not angry, just distant. We're taking a pause. We're re-evaluating strategy. We wish you well. Inside her team, the mood shifted from defiant to disoriented. A communications aide, just weeks into the job, quietly resigned. Two senior staffers followed by midweek, citing professional differences. The press secretary, once Boebert's most loyal media defender, went silent on social platforms and locked her account. None of this was explosive, and yet to those paying attention, it was unmistakable. The floor beneath her campaign was no longer solid. But it wasn't just the loss of resources. It was the growing sense that the narrative had left her behind. She had become the face of a moment she couldn't outrun and couldn't redefine. Every statement she issued now seemed smaller, more desperate. When she tweeted about border security, the replies were flooded not with rebuttals, but with screenshots of the quote, "She plays Congress like she plays poor people." The internet didn't forget. It reframed. And Boebert, despite her usual bravado, began to show strain. In one closed-door meeting, an aide suggested pivoting to an apology, something controlled, rehearsed, issued through a Sunday column. But Boebert refused. "I'm not bending to a woman who didn't even name me," she snapped. "You don't apologize when you're right." The room went quiet after that, not out of agreement, out of fatigue. Then came the leak. An internal email surfaced midweek, published by a political blog known for scooping GOP infighting. The message, meant for senior staff only, was short, but one line in it lit up the headlines all over again. "She didn't even come after me, and that's what hurts most." In 12 words, Boebert said what no press conference ever could, that she hadn't just lost control of the moment. She'd been outmaneuvered without a single direct hit. Her opponent hadn't shouted, hadn't accused, hadn't named her at all. And yet somehow AOC's quiet grace had spoken louder than any soundbite Boebert could conjure. That, perhaps, was the most painful part. Not the public reaction, not the media fallout, but the realization that even her outrage couldn't command attention anymore. She had become the background to someone else's story, a cautionary tale in a rising narrative about dignity. As the week wore on, re-election chatter grew dim. Conservative strategists quietly removed her from their fall campaign trail plans. Her name appeared less frequently in the memos that mattered. Even her usual radio allies shifted toward safer topics. And still, AOC hadn't spoken her name. That silence, once mocked as weakness, had revealed itself to be something else entirely. Discipline. A refusal to be baited into spectacle. A kind of leadership not rooted in dominance, but in timing, and trust in the public's ability to connect the dots on their own. Boebert was left with volume, but no message. Followers, but no momentum. A mic, but nothing new to say. And perhaps that was the final unraveling. Not the moment she was caught speaking, but the moment she realized no one needed to speak for her to be understood. She had spoken for herself, and America had listened. It had been nearly 2 weeks since the hot mic clip first surfaced. The outrage had crested and crashed. The headlines had cycled through their predictable rise and retreat. But the story, somehow, had deepened, not disappeared. In diners and union halls, in community colleges, and on church bulletins, the echo of that one sentence still lingered. Not because it was shocking anymore, but because it had peeled something open. That's when the announcement came. AOC would appear on PBS NewsHour, live, not cable, not a viral podcast, not a partisan sound chamber, but the quietest chair in American media, the one that doesn't interrupt, doesn't chase ratings, doesn't rush to conclusions. People noticed. It wasn't framed as an exclusive or a retaliation. Just a sit-down, a conversation. One anchor, one guest, and what turned out to be 20 minutes of clarity that would ripple across the country in ways no tweet ever could. The host began gently, respectfully, but directly. They touched briefly on the clip, not the scandal of it, but the response to it, the live stream, the silence, the shift in tone. Then came the question everyone had quietly waited for. You've had every chance to respond directly. Why didn't you? AOC didn't blink. She didn't lean forward for effect. She just breathed in, then offered her answer with the kind of calm that doesn't dull the truth, but steadies it. Because we're not here to humiliate people. We're here to show people something better. There it was. No venom. No need to win the moment. Just the kind of sentence that reshapes the conversation simply by not adding to the noise. She paused just briefly, then continued, not to explain herself, but to expand the frame. I've been thinking a lot about something Maya Angelou once said. People will forget what you said. People will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And I think a lot of people, after hearing that clip, felt something they'd been taught to ignore, that their work isn't just undervalued, it's disrespected. The host nodded, not rushing. AOC went on, weaving through personal memory and national reflection with the grace of someone who understands that politics doesn't always move people, but humanity does. She didn't name Boebert, not once. Instead, she spoke about the waitress who had slipped her a free muffin during her campaign, whispering, "Just keep going." She spoke about the janitor at her high school who stayed late to mop after dances and once told her, "You don't need to be loud to leave a mark." She even mentioned a letter she'd received the day after the live stream from a conservative father in Iowa who wrote, "You reminded my daughter that politics doesn't have to mean cruelty." None of it was grandstanding. It was storytelling with purpose, wounds named without being weaponized. Near the end of the interview, the host gently asked, "Do you think the country is changing because of this?" AOC paused, then tilted her head thoughtfully. "I think the country is remembering. That dignity doesn't have to shout. That leadership isn't performance. That belonging isn't something granted from podiums, but something claimed quietly again and again in how we treat each other." The moment didn't trend like a scandal. It didn't catch fire in the same chaotic way, but it stayed. People clipped it, rewatched it, shared it not with fury, but with gratitude. It became something rare in modern politics, a moment that didn't demand sides, only self-reflection. A few minutes after the broadcast, the quote from Angelou trended alongside her name. But this time the hashtags weren't angry. They were reverent. Hashtag feel seen. Hashtag better than before. AOC left the studio quietly, coat in hand, no entourage. Just a slow walk down a hallway lit with soft lights and quiet footsteps. She didn't need the story to be about her. She had already done something far harder. She had let it be about all of us. The video came as a surprise. No press release, no producer's call, no political aide slipping it into a scheduled brief. Just a message request in her inbox, sent from a name she hadn't seen in years. Mr. Ruiz, the janitor from her old middle school in the South Bronx. Back then, he had been a quiet fixture in the hallways, rolling his cart between classrooms, replacing flickering lights, picking up the scraps no one noticed, and sometimes when a kid looked too tired or too lost, offering a granola bar from the stash he kept in his locker. She used to call him Mr. R, and he used to wink and call her Little Big Shot. Now he'd sent her a video with a subject line that read, "Thought you'd want to see this. From room 312. She clicked, and for the next 7 minutes, she didn't move. In the grainy school auditorium footage, a group of 8th graders stood on a makeshift stage made of flattened cardboard and mismatched risers. No fancy lighting, just a handwritten banner above their heads. Since the mic was on. The students were reenacting the now infamous moment, not with malice but with honesty. One played a version of Boebert, pacing backstage and tossing out the dismissive line, loud enough for the fake mic to catch. Another, playing a quiet congresswoman in a red blazer, stood center stage, motionless, letting the moment ripple without a single word. Then the lights dimmed, and a new student stepped forward, not as AOC or Boebert, but as everyday America. She recited lines drawn from the real public response, quotes from veterans, teachers, waitresses, moms. Lines like, "My daughter works tips, but she works truth." Lines that hadn't been written for applause, but now drew real ones. There was no climax, no dramatic resolution, just a slow fade into the final frame. All the students standing together, facing forward, the banner behind them shifting into another hand-painted message. "Dignity is louder than insult." AOC didn't realize she'd stopped breathing until the screen went black. She sat still for a long moment, one hand resting gently over her heart. Then she wiped the corner of her eye. Not hurriedly, not ashamed, just present. They're not just learning politics, she whispered to herself. They're learning dignity. It wasn't just the reenactment, it was the recognition that these students, many of whom were likely navigating the same crowded apartments, uncertain incomes, and underestimated zip codes she once did, had seen through the noise and chosen something higher. They hadn't turned the moment into a meme. They had turned it into a mirror. Later that night, she wrote Mr. Ruiz back. She thanked him not just for the video, but for everything he never got credit for: showing up early, staying late, carrying in a system that too often forgot its own backbone. She ended the message with one line: "Tell them they made me feel seen, and that I'm listening." She didn't post about the video. She didn't use it to score points or reignite headlines. It was hers and theirs and no one else's. But in that quiet gesture, something subtle had been restored. Not reputation, not revenge, legacy, and not the kind that's built in marble or etched into legislation. The kind that's passed hand to hand, story to story, from one overlooked corner of a school hallway to another. The kind that tells a kid in the back row, you belong. Not because someone allowed it, because you claimed it. Back in her apartment, AOC lit a small candle, the same kind her mother used to burn after long shifts. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. Because sometimes the most powerful messages don't come from microphones. They come from room 312. By the third week, something strange had happened. The pundits were still talking, but the tone had shifted. Gone were the frenzied panels speculating about what AOC would do next, or how this would play in the next news cycle. In their place came something rarer: stillness followed by seriousness. Political analysts, left, right, and uncertain, began to admit something that hadn't fit neatly into sound bites. That this wasn't just a viral moment. It was a turning point, a recalibration, a break in the cadence of business-as-usual politics. Not because it was louder, but because it was quieter, and yet somehow echoed longer. One respected columnist put it this way: AOC redefined what dignity can look like in public office, without ever raising her voice and without once needing to say the name of her opponent. That's not just political restraint, that's cultural fluency. Suddenly, the story wasn't about Boebert's words anymore. It was about AOC's absence of retaliation, the choice to say more by saying less, the refusal to swing when it was easier and politically safer to strike. And that refusal had done something unexpected. It had modeled a new kind of power. Think tanks, some of them long critical of progressive politics, began running opinion pieces not about policy, but about tone. Could grace now be an electoral asset? Could humility resonate more deeply than confrontation? Could authenticity, even in silence, be more compelling than performance? And the ripple didn't stop in the halls of punditry. It began reaching places politics often forgets to touch. In Cincinnati, a 38-year-old bus driver named Marnie posted on Facebook that after watching the live stream, she decided to file paperwork to run for city council. She didn't expect to win, she said, but she'd spent years thinking she wasn't the right kind of person. After hearing AOC, she wrote, "I realized I already was. They just taught me not to believe it." In Sacramento, a waitress who'd been working doubles while raising her daughter announced her school board candidacy with a simple tagline: "Since the mic is still on, I'll speak now." Dozens more followed, women who weren't polished, weren't coached, weren't wealthy, but were done being invisible. They began filing, organizing, even forming support circles across state lines. Not centered on party, centered on courage. The media began taking note of the data. One report showed a 24% uptick in first-time female candidates declaring for local office within the span of 2 weeks, most of them from working-class backgrounds. The numbers weren't just impressive, they were revealing. It wasn't just that AOC had weathered an insult. It was that she'd done it in a way that made others see themselves differently. Not as victims, not as props, but as agents of their own dignity. A congressional historian appearing on a Sunday morning roundtable said it best. We've seen moments where someone wins by striking back. This might be the first time someone won by staying still and letting the country walk toward her. And for once, there wasn't a counterpoint. Because you can argue about politics, you can argue about policy, but it's harder to argue with the quiet power of someone who chose not to humiliate someone who tried to humiliate her. In that refusal, AOC hadn't just ended a controversy. She had exposed a contrast, and in doing so, she had invited a country to consider, maybe for the first time in a long while, what it would look like if politics made room not just for power, but for poise. And that invitation didn't end with the live stream. It had just begun. The moment had passed technically. The headlines had quieted. The cable news panels had moved on to the next fire. But in corners of the country that rarely made it onto anyone's talking points, something quieter, and perhaps more lasting, was taking shape. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, a civics teacher named Elaine Gardner sat at her kitchen table grading essays when she paused to replay the live stream again. Not for drama, for tone. She noticed how AOC had delivered each sentence with weight, not for performance, but for presence. It reminded Elaine of something she told her students often: civics is less about arguing well and more about listening long. 3 days later, Elaine posted the first episode of her new classroom podcast. The title? The Mech Was Still On. It wasn't flashy, just a simple recording of her talking through moments in American history where ordinary people changed the tone, not just the policy. She opened the first episode with a reflection on AOC's silence and what it taught. Sometimes our most important contribution isn't what we yell into the room, it's what we choose to hold when the room expects us to explode. She shared it with her class, then with a local parent group, then a teacher friend in another district. Before long, it had 1,000 subscribers, mostly other teachers, many from districts that hadn't updated textbooks in a decade, looking for something that reminded them why this work still mattered. Meanwhile, in a town outside of Columbus, Ohio, a retired Marine named Ray posted a Facebook status that took his own friends by surprise. He had been a consistent conservative voice in his community, faithful to his party, loyal to his values. But after watching the speech, he wrote, "I may not agree with AOC's politics, but I respect her heart. She carried herself in a way that reminded me of the best leaders I served under. Not loud, not showy, but clear and grounded." The post spread further than he expected. Veterans groups picked it up. Some pushed back, but others nodded quietly, because what he said wasn't partisan. It was human. A week later, Ray received a handwritten letter, cream paper, blue ink, folded with care. The return address wasn't congressional stationery, just Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, New York 14. Inside, the note read, "Thank you for listening. We don't have to agree to listen. And when we listen, we grow." No politics, no slogans, just grace. And that tone, that deeply intentional, deeply human tone, was starting to seep into unlikely places. A pastor in Georgia rewrote his sermon series for the month, What Listening Teaches Us. A high school debate team in rural Montana changed its tournament theme from Who's Right to How Do We Carry Conflict. At a public library in Oregon, a teen poetry group started working on a collection titled Since the Mic Was On, where each student wrote a poem about the moment they realized they had a voice and that it mattered. And through it all, AOC didn't campaign on it. She didn't tour the country reliving the live stream. She didn't rebrand the quote into merchandise or leverage it into legislation. She just kept working, attending committee meetings, holding town halls, reading constituent letters late at night in an apartment that still smelled faintly of sandalwood and printer ink. The only thing she allowed herself to change was the way she answered one question she was often asked at public events. How do you stay hopeful? Her new answer came gently. Because I've learned the quietest moments sometimes plant the deepest roots. The moment had started with a mic catching something ugly, but its legacy was being written in handwritten notes, quiet podcasts, classroom discussions, and front porch conversations between neighbors who hadn't spoken in years. The mic, it turned out, was still on, but now it was being used for something far better. It was late, the kind of late where the streets hum softer and even the city seems to let out a long exhale. AOC walked alone, coat unbuttoned, sneakers scuffing quietly against the pavement. No entourage, no cameras. Just the echo of the day behind her and the cool night pressing gently on her skin. She liked walking home like this, after the noise, after the thinking, after the part where people needed her to be more than human. Here she could just be herself. A woman with tired feet, with stories still unfolding in her chest, with 1,000 things unsaid that didn't need to be shouted to matter. She passed the corner of 149th and Melrose, where the light from an all-night diner spilled across the sidewalk in a warm, familiar glow. Through the glass, she spotted a waitress, mid-40s maybe, wiping down a booth with one hand while balancing a tray in the other. Her ponytail was loose. Her movements were practiced. No audience, just motion. AOC slowed her pace and stood for a moment beneath the awning. The street was quiet enough to hear the faint clink of silverware being stacked. The waitress didn't see her, didn't need to. That was the point. She smiled gently, inwardly, then leaned against the brick just long enough to whisper to herself, voice low and certain. That's who I speak for, and now more people are finally listening. Then she pushed off the wall, adjusted the strap of her bag, and kept walking. Because the work wasn't over, but tonight it felt a little more like it was being shared. 3 weeks after the live stream, just as the noise had started to fade and the world's attention fluttered elsewhere, AOC posted a letter, not a press release, not a tweet thread, but a plain image of her handwriting on lined paper. It wasn't slick, it wasn't branded, it was hers. The post was captioned simply, "Before the moment passes." In the letter, she didn't talk about victory. She didn't mention Boebert or the quote or the fallout. She didn't need to. The country already knew the story. What she offered instead was the closing of a circle. This isn't about who won, it's about what we choose to hear. She wrote about the dignity of the unnoticed, about her own learning curve, about how moments like this don't have to end in outrage. They can end in clarity. She asked readers to pay attention, not just to the loudest voices in the room, but the ones too often talked over. The cafeteria worker, the student who hesitates to raise their hand, the mother translating at a school meeting, the veteran who writes more than he speaks. Let the quiet voices in the room be heard first, she wrote. Sometimes they're the ones carrying the most truth. It wasn't dramatic, it was deliberate. The post was shared across every platform, not because it shocked, but because it soothed. Because in a time when everyone seemed eager to have the last word, here was someone offering the right word. By the end of the day, screenshots of the letter were taped to lockers, refrigerators, city hall bulletin boards, and somewhere in a diner window in the Bronx, one line from the letter was scribbled on a chalkboard. We belong, not when they say we do, but when we know we do. Capitol Hill moves fast. Headlines cycle, alliances shift, cameras follow the next fire. But the halls remain the same, marble, echoing, impossibly bright. It's in those corridors between hearings and handshakes where unscripted moments sometimes say the most. It had been months since the live stream, long enough for the world to move on, at least on the surface. But inside the building, memory lingers differently. People remember how things unfolded, and more importantly, how someone chose not to. It was mid-morning when their paths crossed. AOC had just left a briefing on housing oversight, papers tucked under her arm, shoes quiet on the polished floor. Boebert came from the other direction, walking with a staffer who spoke quickly but wasn't being heard. Both women noticed each other before the aides did. There was no crowd, no lens, no script, just a few long steps narrowing into shared space. Their eyes met. Not long, just a moment. AOC didn't smile. She didn't harden either. Her expression was neutral, steady, like someone who had learned long ago the power of knowing when not to speak. Boebert, usually brisk, slowed slightly. Her gaze flickered, maybe defiant, maybe uncertain. But her voice fell quiet. Neither reached out. Neither turned away. Then a nod. Small, unremarkable, and yet layered. From Boebert, perhaps a nod of recognition. Not approval, not apology, but something quieter. A concession maybe, that silence can leave a mark deeper than words. From AOC, a nod of closure, of peace not with the insult, but with its aftermath. They passed each other without pause. The aides kept talking. The day resumed. But in that hallway, in that unspoken second, something settled, a full circle, closed not with a sound, but with a look. Time passed as it always does. The clip no longer trended. The hashtags faded, folded into the archive of 1,000 other online waves. But what lingered wasn't the sound. It was the shift, the change in posture, in how people listened, in who they noticed when they walked into a room. And for AOC, the moment no longer lived in the halls of Congress, but in quieter places, like classrooms. That's where she stood now, chalk dust on her fingertips, a loose stack of notes in her hand, a half circle of students leaning in, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. There was no podium, no fanfare, just eye contact and the kind of questions that come from students who've seen the world spin too fast to wait for permission. She spoke not as a politician, but as a bridge between what politics is and what it could be. She didn't mention the name. She didn't need to. What mattered wasn't the insult. It was what followed. As her voice softened into the last sentence, the camera of memory lingered, not on her, but on the board behind her. A phrase written in simple white strokes, slightly smudged, entirely true. You can turn off a mic, but not a message. And over it all, a quiet narration, like thought turned into air. Sometimes all it takes is one moment to reveal everything. Not just who they are, but who we are. The bell hadn't rung, the room didn't empty, but something inside had settled. Not an ending, not even a resolution, just a truth, carried forward. And this time, everyone heard it. Sometimes power isn't about speaking louder. It's about knowing when to hold still and let the truth speak for itself. AOC's quiet grace didn't just counter an insult. It invited the country to pause, reflect, and reconsider what dignity and leadership really looks like. This wasn't about politics, it was about posture. In a world that rewards reaction, she reminded us that restraint can be revolutionary, and that the voices we often overlook may carry the wisdom we most need to hear. What's one moment in your life where you chose stillness over reaction, and what did it teach you?